bringing you my favourite features from the world of Microsoft Power Platform. So today we're going to be looking at some of the updated features of components in Microsoft Power Apps. There's been some interesting additions to components recently, which are worth exploring and just seeing what can be done with those features. So once again, this video will be a real-time demo. You'll see what I'm doing right all the way from scratch through to something resembling a finished product. So you can see on the screen right at the moment, I've created a brand new app, which is a tablet layout app, completely out of the box, nothing special happening with it at the moment, completely as it would come if you hit new Canvas app. So the first thing I'm going to do here is to switch on the feature because it's a experimental feature at the moment, which you're going to be looking at here. So of course, being an experimental feature, it may or may not make production. It's something that's been put out there to test. It's not in preview. It's experimental, so it may be pulled, it may be developed. But let's just have a look at it and compare it to other ways of doing things. So I'm going to come to the advanced settings. I'm going to scroll down to experimental features, and the one that I'm interested in is this enhanced component properties here. Fire custom events with behavior and create user-defined functions with property parameters. Going to fire that one to on and come back to my app. So component tab here. So we've got screens and components here. You may have seen my other video around components and what they're for. The fact you can have reusable items like headers and footers and custom controls that you use throughout your app that you can use throughout this app and other apps. But we're going to be looking at some purely sort of function-driven features of components today, rather than it being something to look at and interact with. It's something that purely does a job of performing a calculation or something around that. So we're going to create a new component here. I'm going to call it calc, and the size and appearance really make no difference at all, but I'm just for appearances wise, I'm just going to make it 200 by 200 and just give it a color, because we are going to add it to our page at the end of this, so we kind of want to see where it is so we can click on interact with it, but we don't need to put anything in it, any controls or anything like that. That's all that we need. So there's two ways of being able to interact with passing data in and out of components for what we're looking to do. First, I'll go through the first process of doing it, which doesn't use any of the experimental features, and then we'll go through the same process again, looking at the slight difference that the experimental features brings. So we're going to add a new custom property to this component. We're going to call this one result, and that's going to be an output property, and it's going to be a number. So let's just create that property. We're going to create a new one, which is going to be input 1, and that's going to be an input property. That will be a number. Let's create that. And we're going to create one more of these, which will be input 2. That will be an input, and it will be a number. Let's create that. Great. So we've now got 3 custom properties. We've got an input 1, an input 2, and a result. So the idea behind this component is I want to be able to pass in 2 numbers and derive the result of multiplying those numbers together, just as an example. So let's just click on the input 1 to look at the default. So because we created a number, it's giving it a default of 100. So I'm just going to change that default to 5. And this input 2 is going to create the default of that to 2, just so that we can get some initial calculations going, multiplying those 2 numbers together. So this is a critical part really. So we've got 2 inputs and we want to define what happens with the output essentially. So click on result again, because that's the number property we've added. Then it's defaulted to 100 again. We're going to take that out because we don't want that, it's useless. We want that to be derived from the input properties. So because this is we're doing this way, in the input and the input 1, input 2 are custom properties of the component, we have to name the component first, then get access to its properties. So we would go calc dot input 1, and then we're going to say multiply by calc dot input 2. There we go. So all we're going to do for our result is multiply the two numbers that are coming in. Real simple, similar to kind of a function in JavaScript or a method where you have some inputs and outputs. What happens inside the function doesn't really matter. Obviously, this might be much more complicated in production. It might be calculating some interest over time or loan repayments, something like that. But you want that to be a single source of the truth, a single calculation that's used across multiple places. So you build it into a function or into a component, in this case, behaving like it's a function. So we're all good to go on a component. We're going to be able to programmatically pass in a couple of values, and then we should get a value out, which is the two values multiplied together. So let's go back to a screen, our home screen, for example. Let's come to our Insert tab, and let's pop in our custom calc. So we didn't do anything with the interface, it's just a blue box, but it is now on the page, and we can interact with it. So you can see on the right hand side we've got our input properties set to what we set them to when we defined the properties 2 and 5, which is fine. So I'm going to build a simple little form in here to interact with this component here. So I'm going to put in a text input. It's going to make that a little bit bigger. Let's take off the default text because that's annoying, and make this a little bit bigger, make that 20 point. Just give that a little test, see what that looks like. Put 132 in there. So that looks okay. Maybe it's a bit big. Cool. So let's copy that and paste it again. So they're both formatted the same. And we can put 33 in that one. Okay, great. So I've got a couple of input options now. We've got this one here, which we'll call txt input 1. And we'll call this one txt underscore input underscore 2. Now, it doesn't matter, but if we want to make them ordered the same sequence that they are on the page, we can come here to reorder and bring it forwards just to keep that neat and tidy. So input 1, input 2 in the order that they're shown on the screen. So let's just give the home screen a proper name as well, just to keep things tidy. Okay, so we've got a really simple form now. We've got a couple of boxes here that we can pass some numbers into and interact with. So we need an output. So what we're going to do is pass the values of these boxes into our component and then get a value out from our component as an answer. So let's throw a label on the page. We'll put that underneath here. Again, we'll do a little bit of light formatting on this. We'll make that a bit bigger, make that a 30 point font, and we'll just give that a very light sort of grey fill. There we go, so we can actually see a response from that now. So we'll call this one, let's push that a bit further back. Let's reorder, send that to the back, and reorder, send that one to the back. Okay, so we've got our input, and label now. So let's just call this LBL result. Okay, so this is where we need to tell the component that we're going to pass some things into it and that we want to get some results out of it. So let's click on the component. We've got our properties here, which are currently hard-coded to what we set them to in the default. So I'm going to click on input 1 and to be able to set the property dynamically rather than a hard-coded value of 5. So let's take off the 5. So we want this to be txt input 1 dot text. There we go. And it's replaying that for us and saying it's 132, which is the value which is correct. It is. So that's plumbed in. Input 1 is going in as whatever we type in the first box. Let's do the same for input 2. We'll take out the hard-coded 2, type txt input 2 dot text. So that's great. That's 33. That's hooked up. So we're now passing a couple of values into our function for it to multiply them together. All we need to do now is see the result of that calculation in our box here. So let's take out the default text label that's in there completely, clear that function bar out. So we need to refer to the instance of the calc component. So start typing calc, and there it is, calc1. So once again, if I type a dot, it will give me access to the properties in both input and output. So we want to find our result. And there it is, instantly, 4,356. So let's just tidy that up with a little bit of formatting. I'll wrap that in a text function, and we will use a hash comma hash on there just to throw in 1,000 separated to make the number a little bit more easy to understand. So let's just preview this app now and see what it's doing. So if I put in 5 there and 5 there, I'm getting 25 back. I put in some huge numbers there times this. You can see we're getting up to some huge numbers of billions already quite quickly. But character upon character, it's forming that calculation for me. I can type anything into there and all is good. These two inputs are being passed into my function or my component. The component's doing the maths. Obviously very simple in this example, but it could be something wildly complicated like compound interest over time or something, something that you don't want to repeat many times within the app. You want one central source of that function, which is then used throughout multiple apps. And then that's passing back that value to the output there. So quite nice, quite straightforward, and worthy of to note that that's not using any of the experimental features at the moment. It's all using production features, input and output properties on the component. So here we go, 2 inputs and 1 output. So quite a simple example of how you can use components purely to perform calculations based on inputs and outputs. So you're not using any of the visual display or controls or anything like that. You're literally just using it as a input-output function engine. So let's look at a slightly different way of doing that. We're going to achieve the same thing using the preview features on this now. So I'm going to create myself a new component. I'm going to call this one, let's call this one work. Let's differentiate it from calc. Once again, I'm not going to be using any of the UI stuff in it, features like that. It's all just going to be numbers going in and out. So let's just give that a slightly different look. We'll make that a green box, and we will again add a new custom property. We're just going to add a single one at this point. It's going to be the result, and it's going to be an output, and it's going to be a number. Now you'll notice, because I switched on the experimental feature, we've got this new area at the bottom here where I've got the ability to then add parameters for this property. So rather than me having separate properties for the inputs and outputs, I'll have a single output which will then take a couple of inputs. So I'm going to add a new parameter to this custom property, and we'll call this one input 1. Again, because we're doing maths type stuff, we will use numbers. We'll want that to be required. Create that, and we'll create a new one here as well, which will be our input 2. Oh yes, I already used one. Input 2 parameter, and that's also going to be a number, and that will also be required, and I'll go ahead and create. So we've now got a single result property, which is an output property, a number, which we'll be able to access in a minute, and we're using a couple of input properties now, input 1, input 2, which is numbers, but as a single property rather than multiple properties. So let's create that. We'll come again to click on our result here on the left, which will give us our default. Again, exactly as before, we created that as a number, so it's going to give us that 100 default, which we're going to remove. Now, it's a very slight difference here. I don't need to actually refer to the properties as work.property like I did last time, like calc.input and calc.input. I can just refer to them as the names I created them. So I can just do input 1 times input 2. Because I'm referring to result as a property, and input 1 and input 2 are essentially part and parcel of that property because they're parameters that are associated with that result property. I don't need to, they're not sort of broad global properties of the component itself. They're constrained within the result property. So really simple. Once again, going to have an output called result, which will be input 1 times input 2, exactly the same. So that's everything I need to do on the component. So we'll go back to a screen to look at how we implement that and how the very slight difference between using the existing production version of components is going to change if you use these preview features, or experimental features actually, rather than preview. So we're going to use the same input 2 forms, the same input fields, but we're going to create ourselves a new result so we can see the difference, if there is any, in speed or anything else. So I'm going to copy that, going to paste it, get an exact copy of that result. And rather than this being as a result of calc1 outputting it, we're going to use the other component. So let's just add that component now. Let's go to custom, and it's called work. There it is, it's the green box this time. Doesn't matter where that sits on the page, as long as it's there somewhere. So you'll notice if I click on that, actually now I don't have the ability to pass any parameters into it, which is weird, because all I set was a single output, and then I created additional parameters for that output. So how do I feed my values into it? So this is the main difference between these two approaches. If I come to this box here, which I want to be my secondary result as a result of the green, so this left hand box is using the blue, right hand box is using the green work component. So I'm going to just remove everything that's in there at the moment, come back to scratch. So here's where I want to actually reference my component, which I called work. So let's go work1 dot, and I called it result dot result. Now this is where it gets interesting, because you think, okay, well, I've got a red squiggly. What's it complaining about? What's the correct syntax here? And actually, because it's become a function in effect, I actually have to use sort of function type syntax. So I use an open bracket, and you can see it's now starting to question or provide me with feedback as to what the parameters are required. Similar to if you've used Power Automate as a function engine. So it's requesting input 1 and input 2 parameters. So once again here I can actually reference the controls on the page. Input 1 dot text, comma, and then it's going to ask me for the second parameter, which will be txt input 2 dot text. Round it off with a nice brace. You can see straight away it's arrived at the same number, of course. I haven't yet put the formatting on it, but let's go ahead and do that as well. So I'll wrap that in a text function. Let's take off caps lock, that will look better. Put a comma on that, and we'll use the same hash, comma, hash syntax. There we go. So we've got, let's play this and see what we've got. So we've got two components on the page. One is using current production functions, inputs and output parameters separately as separate properties. The one on the right, the green one, is using the preview experimental features actually to pass in input parameters against an actual output property. But you can see they're arriving at exactly the same number. And if I actually start typing numbers, you'll see that there's no difference essentially in the way that they operate. They're arriving at the same figure at the same time. Obviously, it's not a particularly taxing calculation I'm doing. We could throw a more complicated calculation at it, passing in years or whatever it might be if you're working out compound interest or repayments on a loan or something along the lines of that. There might be a difference in functionality, but both performing the same action essentially. So let's just quickly wrap up and round off what we've learned really from this one and the two different approaches. So we ended up creating a couple of components here that had no visual look to them at all. They were simply just colored blobs essentially, but all we did for the first one was pass in, we used separate custom properties for everything basically, an input property, two input properties and our output property. We configured our output property to calculate the result based on the two inputs, but here we had to actually expressly reference the name of the component when we did it. We then did it slightly differently in this work component here, in that this result property here has its own specific input properties, which is a bit different way of doing it. And we hooked up that to just be input 1 versus input 2, where we didn't actually need to reference the name of the component each time. And then when we came to use them, the very slight difference between the way that they were used. Within this one, we can reference calc1.result because we're passing in the input properties directly into the values here. This is where we passed in our txt input1.text, and then the second input had the second input text passed into it. So a little bit more configuration required here, because I actually had to hook up the input properties to the controls on my page. With this one here, it actually took a lot less configuration in its usage, because it doesn't expose any properties here. The properties are exposed actually kind of at runtime, more like a method. So when I actually ask for the result from my work one instance of the component, it's saying, okay, you can have that, but you've got to provide us with a couple of inputs directly into the request. So really everything happens within that label for this one, which may or may not be easier, because every time you create a new one of these, it could be taking inputs from anywhere else on the page. You don't have to hard code it, the hookup, like you do with this one. So I could, for example, have another couple of text fields over here on the right, and I could create a new label, and I could pass in two different input boxes into my method for that one, which I couldn't do with this one, because they're slaved with a one-to-one relationship between my inputs and my controls. So very similar result that you get. I'm not sure it's making 100% reason to do it at the moment. I can see that the benefit really in that you can reuse that same component over and over again with different sets of controls on the page if you wanted to. Like I said at the beginning, it is an experimental feature, so it could end up being progressed and changed. It could end up being dropped. That's the definition of an experimental feature. So at least that shows you kind of how you can use it, and what the difference is between doing it in the existing ways of passing parameters in and out of components. So I'm hoping to do a video soon on sort of some of the broader changes around components. There's one thing which we didn't cover in this one deliberately, which was, if I come back to here, for example, and add a new custom property, you may have noticed during some of the demonstration that there's an additional option here for the property type of behavior. So I'll probably record a separate video for just explaining how that can be used to do some nice features. But essentially enables you to expose a sort of a function or a method for that component externally, so you can click a button in one component and it does something in another component. I've got some examples of that, and I'll probably record a video on that very shortly. So I'm hopefully you found that to be useful and interesting. As always, thanks for joining me, and I look forward to seeing you all on my next video.